So, hello everyone. After the fact that I was called up for the keynote and Mike's introduction, this slide is slightly superfluous. Probably the only thing is, if you want to follow me on Twitter, that's my handle. So, we're here to talk about quick start, so I thought really I need to talk about OSGi modularity in 60 seconds. So, let's start by talking about modules. OSGi is all about modules. It is a modularity framework for Java. And these things that we have are known as bundles. When we say an OSGi bundle, it is a module. You've got private internal state in your bundle, and you've got packages that are shared between them. Those shared packages must be exported, and you have to import those packages in order to be able to use them. So you'll often see pictures like this where you have your modules with some kind of dark colored exported package being consumed by a light colored import package, and then some indeterminate color in the middle with your private data. Lots of pictures like that. Now, all of this metadata that describes your modularity lives in your bundle manifest. And there are lots of headers. They define all sorts of things, like a useful name for the bundle, because everybody knows that using a file name as the way to identify your jar sucks, because if someone changes the file name, did they really change what the jar was? We have version in there, because again, if you change the version number in the file name, have you really changed the file? And this list of imported and exported packages for your bundle. There's a whole bunch of other requirement and capability metadata that we can add in there. And it's really important that we get this right. Yeah? If you screw this up, then things will go badly wrong for you. Now, services are another really important part of the way that modules interact. This is how you get one module to talk to another without having to violate encapsulation and go and dig around inside and work out how to construct an object. This is what the service registry is for. It gives us dynamic, loosely coupled interaction. Now, what do I mean by dynamic? What I mean is that we can install a new provider and then say, okay, well, we're going to keep using the one we already had because we quite like that guy. But if he then disappears, we can wire up to the other provider and everything continues. This is what we mean by dynamic. You can switch around and that's okay. So I'm saying they're dynamic. That does mean they can come and go at any time. And your service probably depends on a whole chain of other services. If your dependencies go away, you must unregister your service because your service is no longer able to do what it says it can do. So if you've got a change somewhere, it will cascade across and you'll get a significant ripple through all of your modules. Again, failing to do this properly means that your bundles will be bad and your applications will not work well. So developing OSGi, well, I will accept that my existing thing already took more than 60 seconds, and now I'm going to talk to you about writing stuff. So, let's keep going. You can write your Java code as normal, which is a relief, right? But you do have this manifest that we need to get right. And just a quick show of hands, how many people can know by just looking at a few of their classes exactly what packages they use from the JRE and all the libraries that they use? Yeah, 0. That's about what I expected. Also, you've got these services, and if you're using them, you've really got to listen for them because you need to know when they come and go. And if you do this wrong, you get ordering problems because if you just assume a service is going to be there, you need to make sure that you've started up the person whose service you're using before you begin. And if you end up in a loop, then you're totally stuffed. Isn't this all great? So the reason that enRoute exists is because there genuinely are headaches out there. If you don't have things to help you, or you don't have decent tutorials to follow, life is not necessarily very good. So when people start for the first time, a lot of them do look at the spec, because we've actually made a lot of effort to make the specs public and easy to read. They are probably the most human readable specifications out there. But the problem is that they get to bundle activator part of the core spec and then think, hooray, I've found my main method. How many people at the beginning of joining the OO revolution way back when were found lots of people who'd learned something like C, and then they found, oh, Java's main method, right, I know everything I need to know to start programming. It's exactly the same with bundle activator. The problem is that the compendium spec has so much good stuff in it, and people just don't see it. They also look for examples on the internet, and the internet is a great place. But the problem is that everything is on the internet, including all of the old stuff and the stuff that was just never very good to start with. And it never goes away, right? There are still examples that you can go to, and they come surprisingly high up the Google rankings, that talk to you about how you handwrite your manifest. If you ever find one of those examples, please stop reading, and ideally, if you can find a way to delete that link from the internet, do it. There are lots of good ways to write OSGi stuff. It is not that hard anymore. But you do have to do it right, and you do have to know what these things are. And this is the bootstrapping problem that so many people have. Also, whilst there are good tools, they're not always that easy to get started with because, again, this is open source, right? Documentation is a luxury. We have done lots and lots of work in OSGi over particularly release 6 and release 7, focusing on making things more user-friendly. We have added loads of cool new features, but mostly what we've done is we've worked on making the stuff that we already had much, much easier to use. You have annotation-driven services, requirements, capabilities, all of this weird syntax that goes in the manifest. It is rare, if ever, that you touch that anymore. You do it in nice, type-safe code that kind of makes sense to read. So what we needed was we needed a go-to place where you could demonstrate things like the best practices, what we should be using. Some kind of tool chain that isn't completely new and scary for everyone who comes across it. This is for people who don't know OSGi. They've never heard of BND before. And then we need some worked examples. We need the OSGi compendium that contains all this cool stuff. We need people to actually be able to say, okay, that's the bit I want, and that's how I use it. Great. So enRoute is a GitHub project which is using Maven to provide 4 things. Some example projects. So this is how you can use some of the core, not only the core, but also the compendium specifications that you probably want to be using to accomplish common tasks. A bunch of archetypes to make it easy to set up these projects in vaguely the right way, so you're not constantly fighting the tools as your first few steps. Some indexes. So these are Maven dependencies, bills of materials, and also OSGi repository indexes that you can use to find stuff. Because it turns out finding stuff is often one of the big problems people have. And a website which shows you how to do all of this stuff. We understand that, unlike in open source, documentation isn't really a luxury. We need people to be able to go places and find out what they should be doing. I do get asked by people, why are you using Maven? Wasn't there this whole thing using Gradle before? Isn't Gradle amazing? And we're using Maven because it is the right thing to do. I hate to say it, but it is the right thing to do. There are a lot of people who love Maven. There are a lot of people who hate Maven. What you don't find is many people who don't know what Maven is and have never used it before. And the whole point is that we're trying to appeal to people who are learning OSGi, and the last thing we want to do is to say, oh yeah, in order to use OSGi, you need to use Gradle. And the first question is, what on earth is Gradle? we are not looking to give you a tutorial in build tool usage. We are looking to give you a tutorial in OSGi usage. Yes, there are absolutely great tools for Gradle and people should use them, but we need to onboard people in a familiar way rather than spending the first 5 pages teaching them about a completely different model of working with dependencies than they've ever seen before. So also, layouts and patterns. We have archetypes, we have a standard structure where people don't feel my OSGi bundles are something fundamentally different from my jar files, because they're not. An OSGi bundle is a jar file. So let's do what people do to build jar files. Oh, and it's kind of nice that people can continue to use all the other plugins that they want, and they don't come to us and say, how do I use plugin X with OSGi? And say, well, it's just Maven. Just go and follow the docs. The good thing is also that with Maven now, it wasn't necessarily the case a few years ago, but now there are lots of good plugins that allow you to do all of the stuff you need to do. So we talked about the build and its Maven base. So now we want to talk about the examples. So these are things that are using compendium services. So we have the JAX-RS whiteboard as a way of providing microservices, transaction control for data access. So we actually demonstrate using transactional data access, which is one of the things that people often fall over. If you look at the kind of list of questions, you've got the initial, how on earth do I get hello world working? And then the very next thing is, how do I make JPA work? That's pretty much the flow of questions on a mailing list. We have examples using and customizing the OSGi converter, which is one of these utility things that loads of people will skip over and think, why do I need that? Until you finally start using it and you think, why didn't I use this 5 years ago? And each example on the website has a nice guide to the key points of the example saying, this is the important bit that you should pay attention to. And because we've got everything set up correctly, all of this metadata and service management is done automatically. All of the hard stuff that absolutely is hard if you try and do it by hand is done automatically, so you don't need to worry about doing it. You don't need to go and look at your manifest and say, do I need to put a comma in there? Have I successfully listed all my packages? Just, who cares? We then have the archetypes. So for those of you who don't know, an archetype is just a fancy name for a template. You get them from repositories and use them through Maven tooling, so they're very easy to use. There are quite a few different enRoute archetypes. You can find them all under the enRoute group ID. They allow you to set up a new build, so set up a reactor which has all of the kind of parent setup for your build, create a simple API bundle, JAX-RS microservice, integration tests, so if you want to do bundle level testing, you can do that. Also wrapping up and giving you a runnable jar file that you can actually execute. There's a load of them. And then you have the indexes, which I come to last, and people kind of say, okay, fine. In some ways, this is the most important thing that we've got, because everything builds on top of these indexes. They are not just a useful little thing on the side. These are the core of what we're doing in enRoute. Because it's really hard to find the right stuff, right? People say, oh, I want to find the ability to do HTTP. How do I find where there's an implementation of the whiteboard spec? And there is a page on Wikipedia that's reasonably well kept and up to date, but still people struggle to find the stuff that they want. And when they do find stuff, it's not always that good. So the indexes are there to give you nice sets of dependencies that are complete and work together. This gives you reference implementations of the OSGi specs as well. So if you want to use the specs, you can. And they've all been checked over. They are all reasonably good OSGi bundles. So the stuff that you're using isn't going to start immediately tripping you up when you try and do something with it. Then the website is, unsurprisingly, available at enroute.osgi.org. It's a GitHub Pages site, so you can absolutely come and make contributions, make it better. This is supposed to be an open standards organization that's a community effort, so please, if you find something that you think is wrong or confusing, help us make it better. The primary goal is to explain the examples that we have. So to read through them, find out what the key points are, what the intent of the example is in terms of what we're trying to do. So there are step-by-step tutorials for some of the examples to actually recreate them yourself. All of the stuff is designed that you can run it from the command line. There are optional instructions at the moment just covering Eclipse, but if someone wants to fill it in for IntelliJ, then please, by all means, go ahead. And it's also got some basic background and some frequently asked questions. So, using enRoute. I'm aware that I've been going for 15 slides now with no pictures. This is very, very bad slideshow etiquette. But you've all done really well. I've not seen anyone fall asleep yet, even though it was a late night. So the whole purpose is it's supposed to be really quick and easy, right? So probably the best thing for me to do is to tempt the demo gods and actually give it a go. Now, so first things first, I did do a very quick check earlier, but can people at the back read that text size? I can go bigger if you need. Okay, this is good. So the first thing that I really need to do is make use of the wonder that is M2E. By the way, there are some lovely bugs in M2E's archetype generation. I normally do this from the command line, but I found switching between the terminal and Eclipse all the time made the demo stuff take about 3 times as long. So what I'm...
The terminal plugin in the future, then your terminal is inside Eclipse.
Okay. So one of the really nice things is that the enRoute archetypes actually properly released to Maven Central yesterday, and they're there, they're reflected, so all of this stuff is live and you can find them. So if we take a look for oh, thank you. Now, of course, my network's down. Backup phone. Never travel without it. No, internet doesn't love me today, so I'm afraid I'll have to cheat. No, it's okay. The easiest thing to do here is if I so, because of course I'm the guy who did the release, I should actually have all of these things installed in my local M2. So here we go. So trust me, it is there in Maven Central. It took me about 4 days of making it get there, so I'm pretty darn sure. But what we're going to do right now is create a new build. So let's call this Quick Start. And what you'll see has been created for us is pretty boring, but we have a relatively simple POM file that gives us access to things like OSGi snapshots and Apache snapshots if we want them, also the latest snapshots of BND if we're really interested. But by default, we're using BND 4.1.0, which is the thing that's going to give us support for OSGi R7. And it gives us the access to things like the OSGi API, some enterprise APIs for things like JAX-RS and Servlet, the implementations of various of the reference implementations I was talking about. So these are the enRoute indexes. And it sets up a bunch of plugins that are going to give us the ability to automatically generate our bundle manifest, generate indexes, resolve against the indexes to create the targets for our exports and for our testing, all of this good stuff. So that's nice and easy. So I suppose the next thing I should do is actually create a module. So let's call this REST. So org example REST, and so this is one of the bits where if I'm not careful, M2E is going to mess me up, because it likes to believe that it can rename the package without telling the archetype plugin, which does not work. So see if I got that right. Woohoo, everything compiles. So what we have here is a really simple REST component. So for those of you who maybe saw some of the talks in here yesterday, you might have seen Dirk talking about doing the JAX-RS whiteboard. That's what we're using here. So we have a really simple service, which is our REST component, which we're exposing through the JAX-RS whiteboard. And this one obviously doesn't do very much by default, but we can start using that to do some pretty cool stuff. In terms of the actual setup, one of the things you may notice if you're familiar with using BND at all, you may be pretty used to seeing lots of BND files around. There are no BND files needed because by the time you get to R7, you can do basically anything with annotations. It is rare, if ever, that you will see a BND file because they're just not needed. The defaults are good enough and the annotations allow you to customize in lots of cool ways. So the POM itself is just really, really simple. You will see we create our module, we have a dependency on the OSGi API, which is the thing that's giving us the DS annotations, have a thing for the enterprise API, which is giving us the JAX-RS annotations, and we've got the test bundles here, which is what gives us things like JUnit and Mockito for our unit tests. And then all we're doing is enabling the BND Maven plugin, and we're off. So really simple. You don't tend to need to mess around with these very much, but that's what the templates are doing. They're setting up your build for you in a nice, clean way that's just easy to use. So having got our REST component, probably the next thing we're going to want to do is actually be able to run it. So let's create an application project. Oh yeah, that's what it is. So what this wants me to do is it wants me to put in, you probably can't see at the back, but it's just asking for the artifact ID of the main project that I want my application to focus on. And this is going to allow it to automatically set up quite a lot of the initial requirements and dependencies for me. So having done that, I can now click Finish. And you'll see here we have this application project. Now applications do have some BND stuff in there, and that's because the way that we are creating our application is we need a list of bundles that are going to get merged into it. So you'll see here we have a BND run. It's pretty simple. it's making use of an index. So this is generated for us by the BND Indexer Maven plugin. You don't need to worry about generating indexes manually. And you can see I said here earlier it needed to know what the artifact ID was for the project. That was so it could do things like add this requirement. So this requirement here was generated because we said this is an application that wants to expose this module. And you can add more requirements in here if you want, but one of the things you find with release 7 is that actually it's really good at building up the set of requirements and capabilities so that you end up with an application that works as a whole. So if we now actually take a look at this from here and hit resolve, what we will find is that based on having exactly one bundle that we required, which is our application bundle, because we used that JAX-RS annotation, we've pulled in the whole JAX-RS whiteboard. And because the JAX-RS whiteboard builds on top of the HTTP whiteboard, we get that too. So suddenly, rather than having to go and dig around and find all of this stuff, it's just there for you because we have the indexes that supply you with the useful things you want in the right form for you to consume them. So this is all goodness. And as a result, having just done that, I can then save. And if I want to, I can just run. And what I'm actually not going to do is I'm not going to run that one because another cool thing we've got is this debug BND run. So this is inheriting from the application BND run. That's what that little twiddle include means. It means include that BND run and pull its stuff in as, as a head of mine. And we can then do things like add a test index. So this is going to include things that we need at test scope. And you can see we've got a few additional requirements here as well. We're adding a requirement for the web console and for the GoGo shell. And the reason that I like using this is because if I resolve and run it, then I actually get access to my GoGo commands in the Eclipse shell. One benefit of having imported from the application, you'll have noticed in the run requirements here, we don't actually list our application at all. And it's because this is a merged property. So BND is actually keeping the requirements that we had in the application and then merging in the debug requirements. So you never need to worry about keeping these files in sync. You just make sure your application is where you put your application requirements, and then you can just re-resolve the debug and you'll always pick up those latest requirements. So there's no worry about, oh, what if my debug isn't debugging the same application? It always is. So time to moment of truth, hit run. And we should be able to see here, if I list my bundles, yeah, we have a whole load of bundles running. So that's all the stuff that we've resolved in. It may look like quite a few bundles. A decent chunk of that is the debug stuff. So it would be quite a bit smaller if we didn't have GoGo. I just then also wouldn't be able to show you what was running. And if we look now, so this is the enRoute website in the background, but if I go to localhost 8080 rest, you can see the hello world that we had earlier. And one of the benefits is that whilst you can do all of this from the command line, no problem, because we're in BND tools, it's actually going to be able to do things like hot replace these bundles. So if I make a change and save it, I don't need to stop and start. I don't need to re-resolve even. What I can just do instead is go and hit the same URL, and it's running my latest bundle. So whilst we've made a really big focus on making sure that you can run exactly from the command line and do everything you want, there is still lots of value in having a good IDE. This is one of the reasons why we want to make sure that we're not focusing on Eclipse to the detriment of IntelliJ users, because we want everyone to be able to use it. But we still want to make sure that it's a really good experience, so we're using the tools that we know work really well together. So I think I've now got about 5 minutes left. So I am at this point Going to move back to standing up, having tempted the demo gods for long enough. I just want to say at this point, it's really important for the speakers. You may not realize it, but getting feedback is what allows us to know what works, what we need to work on improving, whether the thing was just a really terrible idea for a talk in the first place. Please do sign in and let us know what you thought of the presentations. We do read it. It does help us to improve for next time. And having got 4 minutes left, there's time for a few questions. Yeah?
What's the intended use of enRoute? Is it just for getting started with OSGi, or is it also for productive use?
So we are absolutely targeting people who want to get started, but having set things up in a nice user-friendly way using the real plugins and the reference implementations, you can run off and you can keep using the enRoute builds for as long as you want, doing whatever you want. This stuff is formally released. These are proper open source projects that you're using, so you can absolutely do it. What I imagine is likely to happen is you'll get a lot of people starting with enRoute and then actually maybe tweaking it and customizing it, so adding in, for example, we have a very vanilla top-level POM that just does the things that we think you really need to do, but if you want to start adding things like code coverage or sonar, then you can do that. You can add those plugins in the top level and start customizing your enRoute build. Our purpose is trying to get people using something that they can easily grok, they can understand it and get using it, but it's not our intent to say this is the one way to do OSGi. So absolutely start using it. You will almost certainly reach the point where you want to do more with it, and that's great. That's what we want. So you feel your question was answered? Yeah. Great. Question here?
Switch the runtime implementation. You're using Felix?
No, we are using the reference implementations, which means we are using Equinox. There are a whole bunch of wonderfully No.
No. Are you just using some Felix bundles?
I'm using a whole bunch of Felix bundles because Felix provides a bunch of the reference implementations. But if we actually go and look at the application here, run framework is org Eclipse OSGi. So there were a whole load of questions about what we should use, and what we want is we want enRoute to be something that is driven by the community, and the least political decision we could make was to say these are the reference implementations, so we'll use the reference implementations, because anything else involves making additional value statements about what we think are the right implementations for people to use. And you may absolutely go in and say, you know what, with my dependency, I want to put in an exclusion because I don't want to use the Equinox. I don't want to use the meta type that comes from Eclipse. I want to use the meta type that comes from Felix. And that's down to you.
I would tweak the POM XML then.
So you can tweak your parent POM to do exclusions. You can. It's just Maven at this point. You have a set of dependencies that you pull in, and if you want to change those, you should feel free. Albeit, if you start changing your sets of dependencies, you should be aware that you're no longer guaranteed to have a complete set of stuff that works together, because we can't control the extra stuff you add in or the stuff that you remove. But our statement has been very much a flat. We use the reference implementations because that's a non-political statement. Yeah?
Now that you're using the Maven setup in the enRoute tutorial, is the old BND workspace setup obsolete, or is it actively maintained?
So the BND workspace model is maintained by the BND tools team. So I'm going to jump over here. I now have my BND tools hat on. There is a new workspace template that has been added. We've updated all of the templates for BND tools to do R7 stuff. Would you believe we actually use the enRoute indexes as a way to create the template, the workspace repositories in the main template, because it was the easiest way to get a nice curated set of release 7 stuff. So not at all. BND tools is still absolutely focused on providing a really good BND workspace model. It's just not what enRoute does, because teaching people about the BND workspace model, teaching people about Gradle, teaching people about workspace repositories is a whole load of stuff that the B&D Tools team and the B&D Tools website do a good job of, but telling people that in order to start using OSGi, the first thing you need to do is read all of this stuff was a bit of a non-starter. We found that to be a real problem.
So my unsubtle phone alarm says that we've come to the end.